Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Right, as I mentioned about half an hour or so ago, the International Monetary Fund says that despite a strong recovery in global growth, the impact of Britain's decision to exit the European Union has weighed on our economy, and it's downgraded its prediction for UK economic growth this year. Our business correspondent, Jonty Bloom, is here. What have they said?
Well, basically, they said that Brexit has caused a fall in the pound, which has forced up prices for consumers. That has slowed growth, as has a lack of confidence, which has hit business investment. And this latest figure shows that it expects growth this year to be about 1.6%, down from 1.7%, as the head of the IMF, Christine Lagarde, explains.
In this country, the United Kingdom, since the start of this year, growth has slowed notably. The significant depreciation of the sterling that followed the referendum has pushed inflation over 3%, squeezing real incomes and private consumption. Companies are also delaying some investment decisions until they have greater clarity about post-Brexit trade rules in particular. Our forecast for growth in 2017, this year, is 1.6%, down from 1.8% in 2016 and 2.3% in 2015. And all of that despite what I have just mentioned, which is a stronger global environment. Our forecast for 2018 is 1.5%, as uncertainty about the shape of Brexit persists, most likely, and inflation remains above target.
What else did she have to say about Brexit?
Well, those figures, the growth of about 1.6% this year, probably the same next, is based on the idea that we get a pretty soft Brexit, that we get the same kind of deal of access to European markets, especially for financial services and things like that. Now, the IMF does say there are opportunities in Brexit to rebalance and develop the British economy in different ways, but then immediately afterwards says, well, you're very dependent on financial services for your growth, for tax revenue. Companies with big supply chains, like car companies, they're going to want a lot of reassurance. They're going to want free access to the European market. So there's those caveats that with a hard Brexit, this growth of only 1.6% could be worse.
Thank you very much, Jonty. On the subject of Brexit, Europe's chief Brexit negotiator, Michel Barnier, is currently laying out his guidelines for the next phase of talks with Britain. He's just said that the EU has set the end of the UK's Brexit transition period no later than December the 31st, 2020. So we'll leave officially March 2019, end of March 2019, as you know. And according to Michel Barnier, who's been told by Britain, who's now deciding that the transition period, which is 2 years, will be December the 21st, December the 31st, 2020. What a New Year's Eve that is going to be for some people. So transition ends then.
Meantime, the Chancellor has said that the UK needs to avoid a cliff-edge Brexit after the UK growth forecast for this year was cut by the International Monetary Fund. Despite a strong recovery in global growth, the IMF warns that the decision to leave the EU has already weighed on the British economy.
A lot of things have changed. The most significant events were voters' decision to withdraw from membership in the European Union and the government's decision to invoke Article 50. And these two decisions are already having an impact in the economy, even though the UK is not expected to leave the EU until 2019.
Philip Hammond called for progress in discussions in the second phase of talks between the UK and the EU. The Chancellor said that an early transition period would help to secure a smooth exit.
As the negotiations with the EU enter the second phase, it is imperative that we move on with discussions to secure a smooth and orderly withdrawal from the European Union. The IMF report notes that early agreement on a transition period would avoid a cliff-edge exit in March 2019 and reduce the uncertainty facing firms and households. I agree with that analysis.
Speak to our economics editor, Ed Conway. Hello to you, Ed. So the IMF weighing in and saying Brexit's going to cost you. It's underlining what they said last year?
Yeah, it is. And, you know, do we listen to organisations with long acronyms like the IMF? I mean, Michael Gove said he'd had enough of these particular experts last year, and it's partly because the IMF and indeed other people were warning about the economic dangers of Brexit. This time around, they say that all of those warnings have been borne out and that the UK economy is weaker as a result of the vote. Just how weak? Well, I asked Christine Lagarde earlier on in the press conference last year, and it was last summer, just before the vote, that the IMF came. Last year, she said that she saw the risks of Brexit and the implications for the UK economy going from pretty bad to very, very bad. And I asked her quite where the UK was right now.
What we are seeing today is that narrative that we identified as a potential risk in May 2016 is actually being rolled out as we speak. This is what we are seeing. It's not experts talking, it's the economy demonstrating that.
Interesting, Kay, is that, you know, the last year or so, a lot of these institutions, the IMF, the Treasury, they were bowled over, I think, by the fact that some of the warnings that they gave before the referendum didn't turn out to be true. So there was no recession. The UK didn't go off the edge of the economic cliff. But they do now say that you know, the kind of medium road, the medium ground of their forecast, a weaker UK economy when the rest of the world economy is doing very well. That is indeed happening at the moment. So you are seeing the experts striking back and saying, listen, we warned there was going to be damage. Now it's actually happening.
Now, first today, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, based in Washington, D.C., has predicted that a Brexit vote it did last year would hit the UK economy. Well, that didn't quite happen last year, but today it came to London to deliver its verdict for 2017 and its forecast for the year ahead as Britain extricates itself from the European Union. This is what the organisation's managing director, Christine Lagarde, had to say at the Treasury earlier this morning.
Now, in this country, the United Kingdom, since the start of this year, growth has slowed notably. The significant depreciation of the sterling that followed the referendum has pushed inflation over 3%, squeezing real incomes and private consumption. Companies are also delaying some investment decisions until they have greater clarity about post-Brexit trade rules in particular. Our forecast for growth in 2017, this year, is 1.6%, down from 1.8% in 2016.
So that's the boss of the IMF in London at the Treasury there to deliver her verdict on the economy this year and what might happen next year. So Claire Perry, another major economic forecaster, another growth downgrade for the British economy.
Yeah, that's true. And I don't think anyone is surprised because we always knew that the headwinds of inflation, the adjustment that we've seen would be a bit of a drag on the original forecast. But I'm focused, Andrew, on things like the Forbes survey that yesterday said Britain was the best place in the world to do business. The very first time we've achieved that rank. I've looked at the economic data, what's actually going on underlying the headlines, and business confidence is still strong. And this is why we've got to get through this period of uncertainty and get the shape of the deal with Europe as quickly as possible.
But why is Britain now in the slow lane of growth?
Well, because we've had two things. We've had concern over people feeling a little bit nervous about the future. Consumption is slowing down. We've
Brexit.
seen inflation. Yeah, we've seen inflation ticking
Is it
up.
down? Are we in the slow lane, in your view, because of Brexit?
I think we are in the slow. Well, I think growth has slowed because of the period of uncertainty around our exit from the EU, which we thought would happen. But what is striking, though, is if you dig behind this in terms of the fundamentals, we have a really strong economy. We'll get through this period of uncertainty and we will power ahead.
Do you believe the IMF forecast?
Well, I believe them more than I believe the Chancellor's forecasts.
But the Chancellor doesn't make forecasts.
Well, he
Exactly.
he tries to put a good gloss on things in his
But
budgets,
these are the same as the Independent Office of Budget Responsibilities forecasts.
Well, it's all
which are not the Chancellor's forecasts.
No, they're all heading in the same direction, aren't they? Which is downwards, which is obviously a great regret. And I think the main point is that the IMF has said that we need certainty and clarity moving forward to make those businesses feel confident to make the investment decisions,
Exactly.
which is why we need this transitional deal as soon as possible.
The IMF told us before the referendum in the summer of 2016 that if we voted to leave, there would be a major slowdown in growth, an immediate slowdown in growth of several percentage points. It was wrong, wasn't it?
Yes, I think that's indisputable, isn't it? But
so why should it be right about next year when it says we're going to be in slow growth as well?
Well, it's the best information that we've got at the moment, and you can actually listen to what businesses are saying. Vauxhall's in my constituency, for example, the PSA group, which now own it, have said that they are not in a position to make any decisions on future investment in the plants.
What about the Forbes magazine study that the Minister referred to, which is a global study saying Britain will be the best place to do business in the world next year?
Well, that might be next year, but obviously
we're almost there.
What happens after that in terms of our leaving the EU?
Well, if we even were sure what was going to happen next year, we could take some comfort from that.
Well, I don't think anyone can make predictions about anything.
We're not even sure what happened in the last 6 months.
But I think this is, I mean, I do believe experts often, but I think what was very good about the post-Brexit referendum was that we had a major intervention from the Bank of England, who pumped billions of pounds into the economy. Consumer confidence held up. That's great. Next year, the business fundamentals are all in place. We've got the fillip of the royal wedding. I think, and as Justin says...
So the royal wedding's going to come to your aid?
We always, well, no, the royal wedding is nothing to do with politics, but,
They haven't on the same day as the FA Cup. Some people may not notice.
That's two good things to celebrate, Andrew. Come on, cheer up for Christmas.
Depends whose team's in the final.
But Justin's constituency has an unbelievably important part of the car industry in it, and we know from talking in our department, this is why we've got to get the shape of the deal and we've got to get on with it. And thank goodness we had the breakthrough we needed in the last few days from the Prime Minister in terms of the next stage.
You said that the fundamentals of the economy were strong.
Yes.
They're not strong if you're poor in this country, though, are you?
I completely disagree with you.
Have you seen the latest ONS?
On what?
Independent figures.
On
living standards.
Well, two things.
Have you seen them?
I have, in terms of the fact that that wages are still, in some cases, below where they were.
No, that's not what the latest ones tell you. The latest ones tell you that if you're a household in the lowest income bracket, your living standard has suffered more than any other. If you're in the lowest, the people who need the most help are actually the ones suffering most because of how you spend your money. You spend more on food, you spend more on energy if you're in a poor household. As a percentage of your income, you have seen a 36% rise in prices over the past 6 or 7 years.
And that's why the relentless focus on helping people, the national living wage, which, I still think has been a major increase, given increase in incomes in terms of those employment, freezing fuel duty, delivering free childcare. We have to keep making sure that as we move forward...
So the more you look at them, the poorer they get.
No, the more you create good, highly paid, productive jobs like the ones in the car plants in Justin's constituency, the more that you get people who have been languishing on incomes that have been too low for a long time into a better position. You have to fix the fundamentals of the economy,
Right, but you've been in power since 2010.
Yeah, and we've also
And the figures show that if you're in the lowest bracket of income, as a household, you have suffered more than any other bracket. And when will the poorest begin to feel any relief? At the moment, for 10 years now, prices of things they buy have been rising much more quickly than their incomes, despite your living wage and despite taking people out of tax.
Yes, the lowest
When can they expect relief?
Well, two things. So first of all, as we know, when we came into office in 2010, we were dealing with the biggest financial crisis that we had seen in peacetime. We had a deficit that was the biggest in the developed world. It's not right to burden... I mean, look, I know this is
Mr. Osborne said we were all in it together.
And we have
but
all
it turns out that it's the poorest that are in it most of all.
We have had to pay off that deficit, which is now down by more than 2/3. We've worked on protecting those on the lowest income. As you pointed out, we've taken 3 million people out of tax completely.
But overall, they're still worse
and this is
off.
why there's still more to do. And as a country, which is why the whole industrial strategy is so important, we've got to keep investing in the highly productive industries, creating those jobs right across the UK, not just in London and the South East.
What one thing would Labour do to help the plight of the poor here?
Well, we'd raise the minimum wage to £10 an hour, and I think that would have a dramatic effect almost immediately. We know from the...
But it's going to be about £9.50, so it's...
Yeah, we're almost there.
Well,
you're almost there.
We're inching there very slowly at the moment. We reverse some of we'd reverse some of the
these people have had their income squeezed for 10 years, and all you can offer is a marginal rise in the living wage. Some of them, by the way, won't even be on the living wage.
Well, what we've got to look at is the overall picture that the government are facing us with at the moment, which is another decade really of wage stagnation. Too much employment at the moment is based on insecure, low-paid part-time employment, which is why so many people are struggling. We need to get out of that cycle. We need to create high-paid, sustainable jobs.
Exactly.
Okay, that's the aspiration, but it's not a policy.
Yeah, but we've got to do it, Andrew. We've got to, then this is why the industrial strategy, the biggest increases in businesses like Justin's for generations. This is how you give people long-term routes out of low income.
Very well. I'm sure the poor will be reassured by both of you.
The International Monetary Fund, one of the world's leading financial organisations, has downgraded its forecast for the UK's economic growth this year. The head of the IMF, Christine Lagarde, said the impact of the UK's decision to leave the EU had weighed heavily on the economy and that rising inflation and stagnant wages were squeezing spending power. Here's our economics editor, Kamal Ahmed.
She came before the referendum with a warning. If Britain voted Brexit, then the economic risks were clear.
It's going to be pretty bad to very, very bad. So that's what we see.
Today she was back for the first time since that Brexit vote to give her analysis of where we are now.
Since the start of this year, growth has slowed notably. The significant depreciation of the sterling that followed the referendum has pushed inflation over 3%, squeezing real incomes.
How do you respond to those critics who suggest that the IMF is simply too gloomy on the UK economy?
Regrettably, the numbers that we are seeing the economy deliver today are actually proving the point that we made a year and a half ago when people said, you are too gloomy, and you are one of those experts.
Christine Lagarde came here to the Treasury to deliver her report. And let's be clear, she wasn't all gloomy. She said that employment was at record levels and she welcomed progress in those Brexit negotiations. But if I was to identify one big takeout from the IMF today, it's this. In a world of growing global growth, the UK economy has suffered since the referendum. The IMF said growth in the first 9 months of the year was lower than in 2016. It said that prices had risen because of the fall in the value of the pound, causing a squeeze on living standards, and called for a quick agreement on the transition phase of the Brexit talks to ease uncertainty and avoid crashing out of the EU. Around the corner in Parliament, it was the turn of the Governor of the Bank of England, also pushing for a free trade deal, this time in financial services, despite grumbles from the EU that such a thing had never been achieved before.
I don't accept the argument that just because it hasn't been done in the past, it can't be done in the future. We'd just walk away from progress if that were the approach we took to issues.
The hunt for an agreement goes on, and firms like this gin manufacturer in London are keeping plans on ice until there is greater clarity.
It clearly helps that the pound is not really strong and becoming more expensive, but it's not a major factor on that. Until it's clear exactly what's going to happen with Brexit, it's very difficult to commit to further investments here, because if the markets are very difficult to access from the UK, it'll be difficult to justify spending a lot more money growing the business.
It is now all about that clarity. Clarity on any deal with the EU and clarity on the future of the UK economy once Brexit has happened. Kamal Ahmed, BBC News.